right. We're at chapter 23, Freedom Fighters. I hope you had a good Martin Luther King Day off, MLK Day off. And now we're going to learn about African Americans fighting in the American Revolution. So I think that's good timing, and let's check that out. James Forten had to beg his mother to let him go to sea. His father had died when he was 7, and his mother depended on him. Besides, he was a pride and delight. James was bright and full of fun and willing to work hard and please. He'd gone to Anthony Benezet's well-known Quaker school until he was 9, so he could read and write and handle numbers too. Then he'd gone to work, first at Benezet's grocery store, then on Philadelphia's docks. His father had been a sailmaker. Sewing the heavy sailcloth with waxed thread took special skill. James learned the trade and eventually became one of Philadelphia's most successful and wealthiest sailmakers. But when James was 14, there was a war being fought, and he wanted to be a part of it. Like everyone in Philadelphia, he'd seen George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, and he'd heard those words, "All men are created equal." They were worth fighting for. He signed up on the Royal Lewis, a privateer. The colonies had small navies, but they didn't amount to much against the English fleet. It was the private ships that were hurting England. Congress allowed them to attack British ships and keep any profits that they made. James Forten became a powder boy. It was a dangerous job. 18th century ships were wooden and flammable. Cannons were kept on deck, but gunpowder was stored below where it was more likely to stay dry and be safe from accidents. When fighting began, someone had to keep the cannons supplied. It was the powder boys who did that. They needed to be small, fast, and fearless. They needed to keep running up and down the ship's stairs or companionways, even if cannonballs were falling around them and men were screaming in pain. Which is exactly what happened on James Forten's first voyage out. The Royal Lewis met a British ship. There was an awful fight with exploding shells, screams, groans, and deaths. But when the Royal Lewis returned to Philadelphia, guns were pointed at a captive British ship. It seemed as if all Philadelphia came out to cheer. James Forten knew what it was to be treated as a hero. And he got his share of the profits when the English ship was sold. Then he and the other crew members who survived repaired their ship and were soon back at sea. This time, they were not lacking. When the Royal Lewis went after a British ship, 2 others appeared out of the blue. The Americans had stumbled into it's a trap. They were outnumbered. There was nothing to do but surrender. James Forten and his mates were brought aboard a British ship as prisoners. Now Forten had a special worry. In Philadelphia, he was a free person. But he knew that the British often sold black prisoners to slave dealers in the West Indies. And James had dark skin. What would the ship's captain do with him? He was taking most of the American captives to a prison ship, and that was a bad enough fate. Would he take Forten with him? Even worse, would he sell him? Later in his life, Forten liked to tell the story of what happened next. He said it was his skill at playing marbles learned as a boy in Philadelphia that saved him from slavery. It so happened that the British captain had a son who was about Forten's age. When the English boy saw the young prisoner playing marbles, he asked to play. Forten beat him. But James Forten was so likable that the captain's son asked his father to take him back to England and set him free. The captain said he would do it if James would renounce his country. Forten wouldn't consider it. He was an American. And he said, "No, I shall never prove a traitor to my country." And that was that. James Ford spent the next 7 months in an overcrowded, stinking prison ship before he was released in a prisoner exchange. No one knows the numbers for sure, but about 5,000 black men and boys are said to have fought on the American side during the Revolutionary War, out of about 300,000 soldiers in all. Redcoat wrote, "No regiment is to be seen in which there are not Negroes in abundance, and among them are able-bodied, strong, and brave fellows. Some helped England. The British promised to free any slaves who left their patriot masters. They didn't promise freedom to the slaves of loyalists. Those slaves were returned to their owners. In the South, it wasn't easy to escape the British lines. There were lashings and other punishments for those who were caught. But tens of thousands of black men, women, and children voted with their feet. They made it to British camps. Others were captured by the British. Thomas Jefferson wrote of what happened on his plantation. He, Lord Cornwallis, carried off about 30 slaves. Had this been to give them freedom, he would have done right. But it was to consign them to inevitable death from the smallpox and putrid fever then raging in his camp. This I knew afterward to be the fate of 27 of them. I never had news of the remaining 3, but presumed they shared the same fate. One of the slaves who died of fever was named Sam. He was 9 years old. Another Jane was 10. Sorry I mispronounced it. That's really a weird way to say this. Had this been to give them freedom. Weird way to say it. Many white Americans, especially in the South, where blacks often outnumbered whites, didn't want black people to have guns. They feared a slave uprising. So a year after the first battles, a rule was made. No blacks, free or slave, in the Continental Army. George Washington insisted on an exception to that rule. He said that those free black soldiers who had already fought should be allowed to re-enlist, but otherwise blacks were excluded. As the war went on, some people began to see the nonsense of that policy. By the summer of 1777, New England's militias were using black soldiers again and promising them their freedom. Rhode Island had 2 black regiments. In Virginia, black soldiers fought along white soldiers. Most of the southern states used blacks as river pilots and even gunners on ships. Finally, in 1778, the Continental Army changed its policy and began enrolling black soldiers. But South Carolina and Georgia still wouldn't go along. 2 young officers on General Washington's staff, John Lorenz from South Carolina and Alexander Hamilton from New York, tried to get South Carolina to change its mind. They couldn't do it. Why would blacks fight for a nation that allowed slavery? This war for freedom and equality was confusing. The words of the Declaration of Independence were noble. Everyone agreed on that. But were they really meant to be taken seriously? Now that was where there was some disagreement. The fact is, the whole idea of equality seemed insane to some people. Remember, the world of the 18th century was like a ladder, where everyone had a particular rung to stand on. It seemed secure and sure. It was a world where everyone knew his or her place. You were always looking up or down at others. Equality would knock the ladder on its side. Equality is horizontal. Everyone is on the same level. Many men and women weren't ready to make that change. Children often have an easier time with that idea of equality than adults do. Most grown-ups believe that if people didn't know their place, society would fall apart. And they were right. The society they knew, the society of the latter, was going to be destroyed by that phrase, all men are created equal. No one could tell where it would lead, but some were scared. This new idea that people all have equal rights seemed wild and radical. Equal rights? Nonsense, said some. If equality were taken seriously, it would change everything about people's relationships. It was going to happen, but not overnight. You needed to start with the idea. James Forten understood that. So did Thomas Jefferson. So did many others. Okay. All right, so we learned about some African American soldiers who fought for America, even though America sometimes wasn't fair to them. And that happened all the way through World War II, maybe even further. But we'll keep getting better and keep trying to make sure that all people are created equal. All right. Good night. Say good night, Connor.
Good night, Connor.